Well, hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Darlene McLennan and I'm the Manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, ADCET for short. This webinar is being live captioned. To activate these captions, please click on the CC button in the toolbar that is located either on the top or the bottom of your screen. We also have the captions available in a browser and we'll put that link into the chat now for everybody. Okay, I'm on Lutchawidda, Tasmanian Aboriginal land, and in the spirit of reconciliation, ADCET respectfully acknowledges the Lutchawidda nations and also recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of the land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. I also acknowledge all the countries participating in this meeting, and also acknowledge the elders and ancestors and their legacy to us, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating in this webinar today. Feel free to add what country you are on today in the chat. ADCET's really excited to be offering another webinar, this one, Realising Disability Inclusion, and we're doing this in partnership with the Australian Tertiary Education Network on Disability. Before I hand over to the President of ATEND, I will just kind of go through some housekeeping. If you have any technical difficulties, you can email us at admin@adcet.edu.au. Our presenter, Carol, will talk for around 45 minutes and then we'll actually go to questions. We're also playing along in Twitter, and the hashtag for those are hashtag disability inclusion and hashtag edu Twitter. So they're the two hashtags, or at ADCET. At the end of the presentation, as I said, we will have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question you would like to ask Carol, you can add those to the Q&A pod. This is where we will take the questions. There will be the upvoting button, which is the clicking on the thumbs up, and that means that the best question, or the question people want answered, will be sitting at the top, which makes it easier for me to find that and to ask. But we also encourage you to chat with each other throughout the presentation, and please use the chat box instead of the Q&A box. That just enables you to understand who's here, maybe get a few questions happening with some of the things that Carol presents to us today, which would be great. Well, now I'm going to hand over to Kathy. As I said, Kathy East, the President of the Australian Tertiary Education Network on Disability, to introduce the session, and Carol. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Darlene. As President of ATEND, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Professor Carol Evans, a senior leader who's worked across sectors and professions. Carol is currently an honorary visiting professor at Cardiff University and visiting professional fellow at the University of Southampton. More importantly, she's a person who cares passionately about inclusion for all and pushes for this at all times. Carol is also a non-executive board member at the University of Bournemouth, UK. Her previous roles have included PVC, Learning and Teaching at Griffith University, Australia, strategic leadership roles in education and research at the University of Birmingham, Southampton, Exeter, UCL, Institute of Education, KSL, Deanery, London, Durham, in the UK. Carol has produced world-leading research in assessment and individual differences and has scaled up inclusive practices across institutions, as acknowledged in her receipt of a National Teaching Fellow and Principal Fellowships and a Collaborative and Spotlight Award from Advance HE. I first met Carol early in the COVID journey here in Oz, when she started as a PVC Learning and Teaching, and why it was initially inspiring to meet a senior leader in higher education who was so passionately shared their lived experience of disability. I'm pleased we've maintained the connection, and I have in some small way have a hand in sharing her latest research with you here today. Research that has recently been highlighted in the Times higher education pages. And Carol and her colleagues have developed a research-backed framework for increasing disability inclusion for staff and students. Be it a checklist, framework, the start to your risk assessment, a guide, a toolkit, or for making disability inclusion a reality in higher education settings. Though I do believe the framework lends much to other institutions and workplaces also. The Disability Institutional Inclusion Framework is all research-based and provides a very useful guide to addressing the gaps for staff and students with disabilities. And I welcome Professor Carol Evans to share this with you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I would like to thank my colleague, Xiaotong Zhu, who's been doing a lot of this work with me. And also I'd like to, from the bottom of my heart, like to thank Kathy. It's been wonderful to maintain contact with her. And also she's had significant input into the work we've been doing. And I respect and value her opinions and cannot praise you enough. So I'm going to get going. I want to say thank you to everybody for coming today and for giving up your time. So I will try and take you through some of the thinking behind the work we've been doing. Hopefully the slide has moved on for everybody, hopefully. So I wanted to talk about, we looked at a lot of research on disability inclusion and we wanted to say, so what? So how does this make a difference to the lived experience of people in higher education? And although our work was focused on students, the reality is the situation for staff in higher education is significant. So we wanted to look at that as well. And so we wanted to look at the extent to which higher education is embracing for those with disabilities from staff and student perspectives, and does it allow everybody to succeed? If I looked, so basically I've just gone to your ADCET pages and looked at your data compared to data across the world. And I thought I'd just start with a context, brief introduction to that. So access to higher education for students with disabilities around the globe is highly varied. And I've put there the Netherlands, 30% of students with disabilities attend university. In the UK, it's 17% on average, but there is massive variation. If you go to Zambia, 0.1%, China, it's 3%. I think Russia, it's 0.34, if I wanted to be pedantic. And so you sit, I would say towards the lower end of that table, but there are places where it is far more extreme. Student success in higher education, your data suggests it's 5 to 10% lower than those without reported disabilities. In the UK, it's 1.1%, but I'm going to come back to that because I'm going to question some of these statistics with you in a second. In Tasmania, your retention rates are actually higher for students with disabilities, according to your data. And around the globe, students with disabilities tend to be less satisfied with their course. I know this is a generalization, but the data would suggest that. And there's big issues in terms of employment opportunities. And I'm going to raise a couple of issues about that without actually going into too much detail because it will come in later. So I don't want to duplicate. Thought this was quite interesting. This was a YouGov quote, a YouGov poll where they looked at 501 middle managers to say half of Australian managers have never hired a person with disability. You probably know this more than me. And 1 in 10 admit that they wouldn't want to do so in the future. It's quite interesting looking at the work of colleagues in Queensland University who also were looking last year at senior leaders in higher education in universities and how many of those acknowledge or report a disability. And they couldn't find any in terms of the web pages of senior leaders in higher education. And to me, that's a striking statistic, and I will also talk a little bit more about that. I'm just going to pause on this slide here in terms of what does the data look like really? Okay. In all our research, 45% of papers do not disaggregate disability, but I gave you a figure, I could test you on this, that 1.1% in England is how, you know, in terms of attainment, students with disabilities do worse. Is it really 1.1%? If you look at students with social or communicative problems. And if you look at part-time students, that figure goes up to like 10%. If you then factor in some countries, gender, if you factor in socioeconomic class status, and if you factor in ethnicity, just think what happens to that data. So our generalizations give us very little of what the real picture is. And also we analyze data across different universities just in the UK. And the figures are incredibly varied from one institution to another, and also for students with different types of disability. And even type of disability, as we know, that's just one facet. So it's really interesting that only 4% of research actually looks at what I would call intersectionality, which is how disability intersects with other characteristics of an individual. So we get a very biased perspective from disability stats. So are disability stats good enough? When I was at Griffith, I was very concerned about students during COVID. And one of the things I did do was to disaggregate in terms of looking at the experience of students with different types of disabilities as they went through COVID and online learning. And what was the journey like? And even that is at a too generalized level, but it was better than bunching everybody into a bracket that's not possible to bunch into a bracket. If I wanted to move on quite swiftly and then talk about what we were trying to do, we looked at a lot of papers, and I put there, we actually initially looked at 11,000, we got down to 600 articles, and we wanted to see what the state of disability inclusion was. And one of the key things that comes out from all the work we do is the fact that I've put disability is the poor relation of the inclusion agenda. It seems to take a bottom rung compared to other underrepresented groups, and especially so from the position of both staff and students. And I put my hands up to the fact that obviously I come from an insider perspective. I am a disabled person, but I can't compare my experiences with someone else. They're obviously very different, and my experiences change in the course of a day, across time, as I will talk about disability being incredibly fluid and variable across context. So we wanted to look at all of the data and say, okay, so how could we move this forward, and what are the things that we really need to be thinking about? First thing we came up against was how we define disability. And again, across different countries, there are different emphases. So in England, we tend to follow the social model of disability in most universities and talk about disabled students. If we sample if we do a big sample of what students and staff think about labeling, they don't like disabled students. They don't particularly like students with disabilities. I think the latter is preferable to the former for lots of reasons, but other people will have different perspectives. Where I do have an issue is I would go with Shakespeare on this, is that the social model that I find limited, and the good quote from Shakespeare is, we're disabled by our bodies and by society. I can't do many things because my body won't let me do it, irrespective of other potential barriers that there might be in social systems and in structures and institutions. And there is a real battle to be had in trying to advocate in my space, but also in everybody else's spaces, to actually get things to work for you. So it's very individual and it's also societal, but to say it's societal and it's a societal issue is limiting at best. And so I would come out from my perspective and say that I look at disability from an interactional perspective, and this work was taken from that perspective. But we did look at lots of different perspectives through the research lens. But it's important to really think about that. Lots of universities claim to use a social perspective, but actually they're using a medical model. So there's a lot of contradictions in the space, which need honest dialogue about how we're defining it. So it leads to this. This is a long list, and I'm sorry, it might get a bit of snow blindness on this one. We were trying to come down to how particular principles that we wanted to discuss as a team. I was working with 4 students and another colleague, and we were trying to look at the things that we were thinking about. And this was quite important for us before we started doing anything, about that notion that disability is personal, experiences are not universal, that disability brings advantage as well as disadvantage. There are certain gifts associated with it, but there are also certain limitations. That it is multifaceted and fluid. And that's particularly problematic. And also many people would not be defined by a particular disability. And I've mentioned there again, in terms of the notion that disability is intersectional, that in organizations, we really need to think about anticipatory approaches to disability. That what is the extent to which we're using the knowledge across the sector from research to inform the way in which we frame disability and how we support it. And again, a lot of the research will argue that we ignore the social and the practical dimensions of disability in the higher education landscape. And that notion of partnership between students and staff, often the whole notion of disability support seems to be separated from staff and students. And my question would be, why? Why do we do that? If I move on, this is kind of like, I'm taking you to the end. So this is a spoiler alert in a way. So I apologize. So I should get to this at the end, but I'm reversing it. So when we looked at disability, we actually found that there were 12, and we tried to aggregate up because many of the studies are about individuals or small groups of individuals from very ethnographic stands. And I value that research as equally as meta-analysis and randomized control trials. And one of my friends in China will argue, Keith Morrison, he will argue the point that we afford randomized control trials and meta-analysis too much space, and maybe we don't privilege research from other perspectives as much as we possibly do, and disability is an area where that's certainly true. So I'm presenting to you a model where we tried to look at all the different factors that impacted inclusion within a university, and we came up with these 12. And initially they were a list, and we thought this doesn't work. They are all so intertwined, even described as I had there. So we have in this diagram, you've got 12 circles. So you've got basically 4 circles, 3 lots of 4 circles, all intertwined. So at the top, I've got this notion of disability inclusion needs to be owned by a community, not by a leadership team, not by somebody who has the assigned role of disability coordinator. It needs to be owned by everybody. And I put there about that leadership capacity and about the evidence and about evaluation. How are we using data to look at who's being advantaged and disadvantaged? And how are we integrating across the whole of this rather expanded rugby ball that I've got this all situated within? And then I've talked about communications, student and staff voice, training, enabling access through supports and accommodations. And then I move on to this notion of how do we support people to be independent through the particular approaches we use in teaching and learning, through assistive technologies, through transition support, and in promoting self-advocacy. Now, these were the areas that people felt were incredibly important, but there was very little evidence from the research about the effectiveness of these. So again, another spoiler alert. So I will pick up and talk you through some of the areas where we have more evidence and some of the areas where we have far less evidence. And also I want to move on to then talk about, if you could do one thing that would actually change the situation in an institution, what would the one thing be that would cause the whole university to pivot? And how could we enable that to happen? And that's what I'm excited about, because I do believe there are those one big ticket items which can cause a domino effect and can lead to change. But at the moment, it's quite fragmented. So What does the data tell us? And I'm just going to give you a snapshot in the time we have. There will be a report coming out in September and a very big literature review on this area. So I'm not going to go through all of that, but I'm just going to give you some of the headlines. And I'm going to come to this slide first in terms of talking about self-advocacy and also looking at the data. I want to frame this in another way. The data also belies the truth. Because when I talked about that 1.1 difference in the UK in attainment, and I said it could get to 10, probably 20% difference if you factored in all those other factors, but also many students don't declare, and staff. You've also got the fact that many disabled students and staff do incredibly well. But I would like to say that's often at a cost, a massive cost, because the amount of peddling beneath the surface is humongous and also not sustainable. And I want to come back to that in my last slide in terms about that balance between how the institution supports somebody and also what the individual can do. But if that imbalance is too skewed to the individual to have to manage everything, then it might work on a surface level that they achieve and they're successful, but actually underneath, there's only so long that one can sustain that. And I think that's really important for us to think about. So if I look at some of the areas, and I just spend a few minutes on this. Okay, so if I look at that leadership area, if I look at different country reports on effective approaches to disability inclusion, all of them will talk about the importance of leadership without fail. And yet, if you look at the research, there's very little on it. So there's a massive discrepancy between what experts will say is important and what you see covered in the research. We know about underrepresentation of staff with disabilities. I've given you a couple of facts there. I've put only 3.6% of UK senior leaders in academia disclose a disability. I also looked recently at success in funding bids in the UK across the 7 research councils. And I again would like to give you a quiz, but we won't, about how many of those bids were won by colleagues who disclose as disabled across the whole sector for all research bids with UK funding councils. And only about 2% are disabled, disclosed as disabled people in that area. So I think that tells quite a big picture. And in England, we've just had the Research Excellence Framework exercise. And the biggest area that was underrepresented and most disadvantaged was, again, not gender, not ethnicity, it was staff with disabilities that came through in the reports. If I talk to a lot of organisations that work with universities, their argument would be that senior leadership is too removed from the immediacy of managing disability inclusion on the ground. It's delegated down, and that overview of how all the moving parts come together is somewhat missing. So if I now move on and look at some of the other areas, again, there's a massive driver to look at what works. And in fact, the report that we've got coming out is looking at what is the evidence of interventions to support disability inclusion, but they are few and far between. Only 4% of research looks at intersectionality in disability, 4%. And I've put there, I won't read out everything on here, but I've put there in terms of only 2% of work actually looks at the postgraduate experience of students with disabilities in higher education. And to what extent are staff and students with disabilities actually engaged in that research as active participants and as partners within the research that is happening in the space. There have been a lot of reports about what counts as quality in this research space, and again, there are areas of research that are incredibly strong in this space, but one needs to also look at how we aggregate up those different findings from a vast number of narrative research studies that there are. But they are quite consistent in their findings about facilitators and barriers to inclusion within universities. I've already mentioned about limited inferences can be made from aggregated disability data. And it is incredibly limiting in terms of one needs to go beneath the surface. In looking across the sector, students and staff with hidden disabilities, with neurodiverse conditions, social and communicative disabilities are renowned to experience significant issues compared to students with other disabilities in terms of perceived bias and actual bias. I'm careful there because it's very different according to which part of the world you're in, which is also linked to levels of development. So one needs to be cautious. So gender and disability may play a very big role in some countries and less so in others. So we need to be mindful of the context in which we're talking. Also the context, so for example, disability and nursing is particularly problematic in terms of disabled students, staff and students moving into that area, and also medicine and science disciplines, particular barriers there might be in terms of inclusion within those fields. So again, it's interesting. However, having said that, there's very little research from arts and humanities around students with disabilities, which is also interesting. That notion of an integrated approach, one of the key findings was around the networks that students and staff have in terms of enabling people to get on. And the argument would be, to what extent is the support that's given to students with disabilities actually joined up to include the practical, the accommodation, the transport, the social networking side, the access to social interaction, as well as academic support. The other argument would be about to what extent is ownership of disability inclusion at the course or unit level and by staff and students, rather than centrally directed or the responsibility of a central unit. It cannot work like that. And again, how do things join up from one part of an organisation to another and across organisations? And obviously COVID has made the whole notion of disability inclusion particularly problematic in terms of accessing services across different areas in a timely fashion. The language of disability is absolutely fundamental in terms of the valuing of diversity, how disability is framed. There are some really amazing studies that make me cry every time I read them around the cumulative damage of what not being able to access spaces, not being able to get into a learning environment, and the impact that has on an individual's interaction with the context in which they're in. And I called it cumulative damage in terms of that constant not being able to access basics. And I'm not even talking about the highest level of provision, and the psychological impacts that therefore has on how that individual engages and is enabled to engage. And that's a pretty colossal issue that comes through, and that's true for staff as much as it is for students. I've mentioned on this slide the extent to which students and staff with disabilities are engaged in design of services from the get-go. And again, we see a lot of work that's asking students and staff after the event, but it's too late for that group. that group. So how are students and staff with disabilities involved in design in an anticipatory way, and how is their voice captured in a representative way, in a rich way? So the lived experience, what do we know about that lived experience? What are those rate limiting steps that impact you every single day that actually make it really difficult and add to load? Training was an interesting one. We found very little work across the sector that evaluated the quality of training. A lot of training on disability inclusion is online. It's a module that you take. I'm being concrete for the sake of it. But does that change behaviours? And does that change the way that people act in the daily discourse of things? What's the quality of that training? And how are resources available for staff? Do staff even know where an accessibility checker is? Do they know what technologies are available to support? All the basics. Are staff given training in the different types of supports that there are available? It's absolutely fascinating that there is so little on evaluating the impact of what training there is and the quality of it. And often large sections of the university population are not included in that training. So they found a lot of like technology support, staff not involved in training in this way. So how is everybody involved in that? This is a biggie. I'm going to make a couple of things here. Accommodations make a big difference. So the supports that students get make a massive difference, and that's probably not rocket science to most of you. So it really isn't. But it's interesting. Students who use the supports available in a university often do better, whether they have disabilities or not. Not all supports are of equal use, and some are of less use than others. We know that. But there is a real issue here around the notion of disclosure. Many students undisclose, if there's such a term, that they disclose year one, and by the time they get to their second year, they realise actually not a good move. So that's quite an interesting thing to look at. But also students disclose in many different ways. So I've put it's layered. They might disclose unofficially, they might disclose in one unit, one course, one programme, but not officially. And the whole notion of the burden of disclosure and the impact of having to disclose. And there is a big question, if we created an inclusive environment, we reduce the need for disclosure. And I have loads of really poignant quotes from students who talk about, and they're quite raw, the quotes I have from students who talk to me, who also explained to me that one of them said, this is very blunt, saying it's like having my guts hung up on a line and people bashing me because I have to go into a room and prove what I can't do. I said, how is that like to start a course like that? And the emotional damage of that for some is massive. And I never would underestimate that one. So that notion of disclosure is a nasty word, is a kind of understatement, but it permeates for a lot of students in that place. Where it's successful is where students and staff own the disclosure process and also are given the responsibility to advocate for what are the supports they need and are they of the right quality. And I've mentioned there again about, I've already mentioned bias before, that it is much harder for certain students than for others, and equally with their peers. Some feel the need to have to justify particular supports, etc. Okay, if I move on and look at, here's an interesting one for you. I have spent a career talking about inclusive learning and teaching, and it's interesting. We found very little evidence of the efficacy of universal design for learning. That doesn't mean to say that it doesn't make a difference at all. It may be the way interventions have been designed that they're so broad, what are you picking up in the space? So I'll be cautious on that one. We do know that embedding reasonable adjustments from the get-go makes a big difference. But I would want to ask people, what do you mean by inclusive learning and teaching? What is it? In actual fact, what's deemed to be inclusive could also be seen to be exclusive. And I would say, can we simplify it down to what it is? Sorry, I'll go back. to what it is that we're really talking about here. Is it about reducing cognitive load? Talk to me. What is it about? Is it making things transparent? Is it about different accessible formats? What are we talking about in this space? Can we be explicit about it? Because at the moment it's a fuzzy umbrella type word, and I'm not sure that we're pivoting in the right space in a way that everybody can move forward with it equally. Assistive technologies, again, make a big difference. The biggest issue that there was, for example, in some universities during COVID, was the quality of captioning. Sorry, anybody today, but the quality of captioning was absolutely fundamental in all of this. But also the other one is training in the use of assistive technologies. And a massive one is that balancing act, going back to what I said at the very beginning, was around that notion of how much effort an individual has to put in and how much support an institution gives. And if I am a student with certain types of disabilities and that support comes too late, I have to make a decision as to, have I got time to learn how to use this, or do I just cope without it? And there are instances where students have done a whole year worth of their courses without the fundamental supports that they needed. So we've lost them for a year. And I think that's unacceptable. And so that speed at which support comes is massively impactful. But it also means that staff and students need to know how to use those, and also not also treat them like a sweetie shop in terms of what's the best approach for a specific issue, and not duplicate or have hundreds of different types of technologies that you're using on an online course, which makes it insurmountable and impossible for us all. So what are the best tools in this best situation, or the range of tools that are best for students in X, Y, and Z? They may be different, but to actually be quite judicious in the use of the equipment, the tools, the technologies that we use, and do they translate across different systems equally well? So if I'm a student walking into work integrated learning, if I'm a student using a tablet, or will it work as easily on that or not, or will I be undone by the technology and unraveled? I'll mention a couple more. We know that pre-university support is massively important. Quite an interesting one here is around that notion that often students are externally regulated in schools and given those supports, and then when we come into university, we're expecting them to manage it for themselves. How do they know what's available to support them? How do they know how to advocate? How do we start that journey with them when they're young enough? An orientation course is too late. It's good, but it's still too late. And what comes through loud and clear is that importance of that first semester, or trimester, that very first experience, that first term in. What's happening in that space is absolutely critical to how students will do at graduation in many examples that we looked at. Again, that opportunity, and it comes into looking at transitions, is early internships. So early experiences of work environments, early experiences of research. But many students from disadvantaged backgrounds or with disabilities may put that off or feel it's too difficult because of all the other supports that are needed to enable that to happen. But by putting that off, they delay those opportunities. And again, those internships do not need to be long, they can be online, but how do they get real experiences that are valuable experiences? And I'm going to kind of finish off today and just talk a little bit about the things that we know in terms of the factors that enable any student or adult to do well. I would argue they hinge around notions of self-determination, the capacity to be able to make decisions for yourself. Also self-efficacy, belief in your ability to do well, be able to advocate for what you need. Agentic engagement is, can I change the environment to get it to work better for me and my peers? And do I believe I can do that? And self-regulation is, am I able to utilize the skills I have in the best way to realize the goals that I have? And how can I have access to, how can I spend my time on developing those skill sets and not losing 80% of my time just trying to stay above water? So how do we make sure that students with disabilities and staff with disabilities time is being used to help them develop those skill sets, rather than being utilized on things that they shouldn't have to spend so much time on? I have another session around this whole notion of self-advocacy, and I haven't got time to go into it with you in too much detail now, but I tried to represent this notion of advocacy in sharing it in two different ways. And this is one way where the top fan is looking at the individual. How do we support an individual to understand their needs, the context they're in, their roles, their rights, to help them realize their goals? And what's the role of the organization in facilitating that? And what's the role of the discipline that they're working in? How are those all working in tune? So how do I, as a lecturer, map out the journey of a student on my course and work out what those barriers are going to be before they get there, so that we can attend to them and start to remove those prior to, in an anticipatory way? And what are those things that are going to make a difference to supporting students to do that? And that's one area that I'm currently looking in, which I think has massive promise in terms of, I once in a job was working with failing doctors in hospitals. And why was it in a rotation out of maybe 3 they had that they were falling off? What was causing them to fail? And again, sometimes it was the environment was very, very difficult. And other times it was because they couldn't read the differences in the nature of that environment. But what we could do is we could teach them the skills to get around those barriers. We shouldn't have to. And that's why I talk about shared advocacy. And so in this one, again, to look at your leisure, is really around this whole notion about the responsibility of the self on the left-hand side of the diagram, and developing those skill sets in self-advocacy and self-regulation. And on the right-hand side, it's okay, so how does an organization do that? And then moving on, I just wanted to finish off by looking at, if we were trying to think about big ticket items that we could use to move forward, what would they be? And if I was being blunt and talked about some of these things and took those 12 areas, then disability inclusion I'd put in the performance review of everybody. It's everybody's responsibility, and it's everybody's responsibility to help get everybody over the line. And I don't think it's the responsibility of a team. I know there are brilliant teams, and I want to hug them all the time. Probably not allowed to do that anymore, but there are brilliant individuals, but also they're being burdened and they're being worn out because they can't advocate on behalf of lots and lots of people. They need to be supported too. So how do we support those that self-advocate? And in an institution, we cannot complain about people being selfish if we reward individual selfishness and we don't reward team effort. So we need to think about that. I do think a route map that lets everybody know where all the different supports are and brings them together in a holistic whole is a no-brainer, because many students do not know the supports are available. When I walked into Griffith, and there was an orientation survey, and in one of those surveys, over 40% of students at one particular point were saying that they didn't feel confident about their ability to do well. It was a small snapshot and it was a small number of students, but you want to catch those students at point of entry, that because low self-efficacy is a big factor. And it's important that those students are supported, and staff did a brilliant job in supporting orientation for students by picking up these early signs at a very good point. I do think I would want module leads, course leads to be able to look at data, to mine that data, to look at the journey of students. And I think the comm strategy about being explicit and also making sure that the communication strategy is joined up is really important, because there's a lot of gap between what web pages say and the experience of those on the ground. I do think we need to make sure programs are developed with staff and students with disabilities and checked for what those rate limiting steps are. I would like to have students far more involved in that space from the get-go. And I've mentioned a few other things there about the clear roadmaps and also about simplifying what inclusive learning and teaching is. Let's get down to basics here about what it is and what it's not. I would mainstream assistive technologies. They shouldn't be an add-on. We should all be using them, and then we'd all become better at using them. We'd create a better environment. I would advocate for earlier internships and shorter ones, but more opportunities for doing that. And I'd certainly be wanting to embed self-advocacy training for all, actually, in the space. I'll finish there because I'm conscious of allowing time for your questions. But there is a thing about how, as a sector, can we move things together? How can we move things together to affect meaningful change? How can we leverage this? I was looking to work with a group of organisations we developed a checklist, and really important to say, actually, how would this work with teams around? How could we move this forward? And where should we focus our efforts? And I've just mentioned that there, and I'm going to stop at that point and say, thank you so much for spending that time having to listen to me. So I appreciate your attention and your listening, but also like to come now and ask you if you have any questions, and if I can't follow them all up now, if you email me, I will promise to follow those up with you. So over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carol. It's been wonderful to see the chat and the level of engagement from people. It's been very powerful for many people. So yeah, it's great. I'm getting a bit teary even thinking about it. So thank you so much. There are a number of questions. I've been fielding them from the chat box and the Q&A. There are a couple in the Q&A box, which I might go to first. One is, can you speak to the role of mentoring for students with disability in helping to implement the DIIF?
Yeah, very much. Mentoring was one of the things that came up solidly, and I think that there's lots of different types of mentoring here. So there is the reverse mentoring in terms of how can students with disabilities support other students. But again, the key issue there was that the burden of self-advocacy for others, that some do that very well, but who's protecting them? But also, how there's a lot of issues around how many students, their peers, do not necessarily have a grounding or understanding. We're trying to live in a more inclusive society. So also, how do we engage their peers in training, which is for society and for their futures, in terms of upskilling students across institutions in that? And also, we know that academic mentoring another thing that was very powerful is students with disabilities joining a research group, even if it was nothing to do with their subject, which I thought was fascinating, because it was about the cultural capital, and then having advocates, academics, to advocate for you. And also professional mentors were really important from a workplace perspective in helping to leverage change in workplaces. And so yes, I would mainstream again. I believe everybody should be a mentor of everybody else, but I do think that requires training. And also, there is a mistake just because I have a particular issue or not that makes me able to mentor somebody else well. Not always the case. I may be too close to something. So there's lots of interesting areas in that space, but definitely it's one of the areas that has a lot of promise, but particularly in terms of the academic research side of things as well.
Okay. Thank you for that. We're getting quite a few questions in, and it's great that you're actually happy to answer those. What we'll do is if we don't get to all the questions today, we will ask Carol to answer those, and we'll put them on the web page where the recording and her slides will be, so you can come back and find those answers at each time. So just one of the ones that have got the upvote the most is someone said, firstly, Carol, I hang off every word you have said today. But as a question, I find the word support inescapable, but quite challenging, as it is often so ill-defined, and rarely do people translate this into concrete or specific behavioural interventions. This may be topical, but do you have any data around what are the most effective and needed supports? Noting this can be difficult balancing act between resourcing and other requirements, or ensuring this is provided consistently by different staff. And sorry, I thought my paraphrasing wouldn't do it justice. So I've just read it out. So
yeah, I think it's also, to me, it's a mapping exercise, and I do think there's a big staff upskilling in this one. And I talk about myself. I know a lot about lots of things, but every day I learn new things, and I'm humbled by colleagues and other students who have different issues to what I have. But one of the things is that for many students with disabilities and staff, you have to juggle many wider networks to enable to keep you afloat. So anything that gets changed late in a program, you can't pivot. It kind of makes you crash. So this is about late changes to programs, and not having complete information about a course or unit prior to you taking it. So if you're not aware of the potential barriers they're going to be, you can't arm yourself or get round those. I remember for me one year I had to learn how to walk to a certain place, and I had to practice it like 100 times before the event, and because otherwise I couldn't do it at one point in my life. And then if they suddenly changed the room at late notice, I was undone big time. So it's those, but I get that certain things have to change at late notice, but I do think there should be an understanding of what that knock-on effect is and how is that mediated for the individual. But a lot of it is not high-powered stuff that people need. It is basic access to resources, understanding that for some people a screen is I had several years where I couldn't read a screen at all. It didn't matter what was and people didn't seem to understand that I couldn't actually read a word on a screen at one point. But it's having that very basic thing about what is it you need, rather than talking to someone about what they can't do. What is it you need in order to be able to have access? What are those basics? And a lot of it is basic equipment, basic tools, but time to learn how to use them, and knowing that there is somebody that you can access if it goes wrong. And so it's not even the high powered things, but it is around logistics. So a lot of it is around logistics. And so I used to get students to do Gantt charts, to look at their schedule and then draw underneath it. They could draw it, they could do anything with it, to say, this is a block for me, this is a blockage for me. And then we used to look at those as teams to say, how do we undo those blockages? That shouldn't happen. But it's also getting the lived experience of those students across different things to actually share that. When I was a teacher in a school and an acting head teacher, I used to get the students to talk about the trigger points and the things that were the barriers to access. And it was very, very powerful that it actually changed a whole environment, because we learned to work out all those triggers, and there are always going to be new ones, but the more open you are to looking at that, I think that the better. The other one was a really clever scheme, is where you get students to produce modified outputs, which benefits the world, and that's their assessment. So I think that's really cool. So I'd be going down those lines too.
That's great.
Anyway, that's one. Another question.
Thank you. Oh, look, there's so many questions. One was just around supporting the best strategies. Could you suggest some best strategies to support safe disclosure? Is there any thing that you'd like to cover more on that?
Again, I think this also goes back to training for staff in terms of, I think disclosure is it is being very honest. I think a lot of the issues around disclosure that we discovered is where students are promised privacy, etc., but then it goes through a comm strategy and it goes to X, Y, and Z. So who does this information go to? Who will have access to this information? How will they use this information? What bits of this can you control? So for me, it's about agency at every step of the way. What do I need? What can I not share, and what can I share, and who has access to it, and why? And taking a student through those steps in terms of that. But it is also training for all of those colleagues that, and what I'm saying is that often the training doesn't include everybody in a student's or a members of staff sphere. And then that's when it can break down colossally. So I do think that needs to be fronted in training, but also the implications of poor management of disclosure and the long-term effect it has on the student.
Yep.
I think it's a massive one.
That's great. As I said, we will get the questions out of the chat and the Q&A and put them up on our website. But just the final question, I suppose, somebody's asked, for the big ticket items, would you see that these need to be created or replicated at each institution, or is there a more coordinated way to achieve these goals, do you feel, within the Australian context?
I'm a strategist that, so for example, there are things often with government policies that you need to advocate for change across the sector if you really want something to change. But I also do think if institutions actually worked together on this, because also look at the flow of students across different universities as well, from moving from one place to another. But I think there is grounds actually collectively to say, and again, one of my colleagues said to me, why do we have to pay extra for everything? You know, Blackboard Allies, Allies very good, but why is everything more money? If I set up a website, I've got to pay thousands of dollars more for this bit of accessibility. Why do we always have to pay so much more? So there's something about leveraging the tech companies, actually. There is something in that space. But I do think institutionally, it's about really, as I said, you're not going to win with a charter with about 500 items on it, because everybody they can't do it. But I think nobody can question the need for change that's now. So it's, where do you start with that change, and how do you advocate it and get across the sector and move a particular area forward? And I think that's also lobbying with governments and regional governments as well, in terms of their backing behind that, and also how can they ease the transition of children through schools into university, etc., and into employment? How can they make that journey from university into employment easier, in terms of the supports that one gets when one transfers from one area to another? But I think there's greater weight in acting collectively, and I think too many institutions are trying to do everything on their own, and I think we should be actually working together. And again, I'm working internationally, but I see it as one family, and I think we should be leveraging, and we should be demanding much more. But I think institutions, it is the time, and I think, what are universities for if they're not for creating more inclusive societies? And let's look at how many people with long COVID. Let's look at the aging population. Let's look at how many people there will be that unfortunately will have to cope with lots of additional barriers that they may not have expected to.
Excellent. Well, I think you encapsulated that with it is time in it that's come to the end, but also it is time for change. And I think there's a lot of great work happening across internationally and in Australia around ensuring inclusive education for for everybody, and also employment. So thank you, Carol. I think you've just started a bit of a movement here. So I'm very excited if we as a sector can connect and work better to improve the access and participation of staff and students with disability. Just a quick heads up, we will be sending a survey. I think someone will put a link in now into the chat, but you will get sent a survey. Really encourage you to provide feedback on the session today. We will feed that to Carol, but also it helps us kind of with our ongoing funding. Also, we have a new webinar coming up next, I think on the 6th of September, which is around for staff in the university sector with disability, and the whole of tertiary sector, including the vet sector, that will provide advice to universities, HR managers, faculty managers, facility managers or so forth, just to make sure that universities and vet providers are inclusive in their employment practices, and that there's a government project called Job Access that supports that. So I encourage you to share that with everybody within your organisation, because we really want to target that webinar to the right people. So thank you for ATEND, and to Kathy for bringing us all together, and for doing this webinar. Absolutely fabulous. And thank you, Carol, for your time. It's 4:30 probably there now, so in the morning, but it's been absolutely fantastic.
Parting on downtime.
Wonderful. All right. Well, we hope you get some sleep, but thank you so much for giving your time and your knowledge to us. It's been absolutely brilliant. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you.